It's my pleasure to introduce Aaron Betsky. Aaron is a critic, curator, educator, lecturer, and writer on architecture and design. He is the president of the School of Architecture at Taliesin and former director of the Cincinnati Art Museum. Aaron will provide observations on design, growth, and development of Las Vegas and its future since its publication of Learning from Las Vegas in 1982, since the publication in 1982, and how it impacts other cities throughout the region. We're honored to welcome Aaron Betsky.
Thank you, and good afternoon to all of you. And my gratitude also to Randy, all the people at the IAA here, to Clyde Juba for sponsoring this, making this all possible, NGM for helping me with my travel. Grateful to all of them, and very happy to be back in what I have come to know as Eric Strain's town, which, oh come on, it really is his town, isn't it? It's, he's really been an amazing force, and he's been my guide here since I've been visiting here since right after the book was published. This is really echoey. Is there any way to reduce that? How's that? Still pretty echoey. Or is that just me?
It's okay.
It's just me. Okay, never mind. I am going to do something maybe slightly different than what I was supposed to do, which is to give a talk which I call Las Vegas Learning, which is to say, we all supposedly learn from Las Vegas, except no one really took those lessons seriously, quite frankly. And even more than that, most of what Venturi and Scott Brown said they learned from Las Vegas, they actually learned from popular culture. They just found in Las Vegas a turbo-boosted version of what they were looking for in Las Vegas. And many of you know that actually the most comprehensive survey they did, and I couldn't find a good photograph of it, so I don't have it. If anyone has a good photograph, you can send it to me. Was this incredible show that they did in 1977 at the, in Washington, D.C., at the Corcoran Gallery called Signs of Life. Sorry, not the Corcoran, the Renwick. Thank you. Oh, how are you? Good to see you. Oh boy, now I really have to watch out. The Renwick Gallery, in which they collected the ways in which we really do live in the empire of signs in the United States. And Las Vegas, as I said, was just a larger version of that. But even more important than that, I'm coming here today as an outsider who has been visiting here for a long time and wondering what is going to become of Las Vegas. So what is Las Vegas going to learn? Or what should it learn? What is Las Vegas learning? How is it developing? And there are things about this city that are both extremely encouraging and things that are very depressing. I'm sure you all know that, and of course, a lot in between. So what I'd like to do is just sort of walk through a little of the building blocks that I see in Las Vegas, both the ones that Venturi and Scott Brown concentrated on and some of the things that they missed. Think then a little bit about where you've come since then and where you might go, and offer some alternatives, I hope, for what Las Vegas could become. So, that's a remote. Let me just launch into it. So there they are. I love this picture. Did you show it already?
Yeah.
You did, all right, okay. The preppy Ivy Leaguer with his back to you, and the confident South African looking you straight in the face at the edge of the desert, thinking about the future. And one of the things I love is that, of course, everyone talks about the signs of Las Vegas, and that's what they're all about. But look where they're standing with this ruin right next to it. representing perhaps also somewhat of the past of Las Vegas. And if they did anything, it was to have Las Vegas, I would hope, understand that there is a seriousness, that there is a logic to the particular architecture of the Strip. That's not Las Vegas, that is the Strip, and downtown to a certain extent. That you can take the way that the buildings present themselves and relate to the street, as well as the nature of the signs. You can create a taxonomy, just as you would with a bunch of insects, and figure out what their various parts are and how they operate. Ironically, that is the thing that nobody learned from, including Las Vegas. None of the work was really applied anywhere in the world, including in their own work. They promised an electronic expressionism. The only time they ever tried it was the National Football Hall of Fame proposal, which is so obscure that, again, I couldn't even find an image of it. It's really out there. Even Alan is like trying to remember exactly what project that was. And they did it right after Las Vegas. It was a losing competition for when the Hall of Fame was going to be in New Jersey. And after that, they abandoned that interest themselves as well. They claimed that they were interested in buildings that weren't necessarily ducks, but were interested in buildings that had signs, but they never really managed to pull it off in their own work. And it took someone like Jerry Van Eyck to show us that that really is the potential of the place. And what's even more frustrating is that none of that really plays through today. It's amazing that I have been told, and this might be completely apocryphal, so forgive me if it's apocryphal, but I was told by two different people, that when City Center was finished, and City Center is, if you will, a duck. It's a duck for the future, for the kind of Oz that all the science fiction movies promised us. They couldn't get people to go there, so they spent more on the sign that's in front of there than they did on at least one of the buildings there, something like $80 million. That sign, however, has nothing to do with the signs of the Venturi Scott Brown era. It's just an electronic sign that is as large as a building, its own monument. So if we can't really learn from them or from what they were doing, then maybe we can look at what is actually here in Las Vegas. What is the history of Las Vegas? What are its components? And of course, it is a marshy area, seasonal runoff from the mountains, caught by the soil here. And it is a history of the Mormons coming down, trying to establish a bulwark here before they were called back up to Salt Lake City. It's a history of a western town, a ranch town with a little bit of agriculture, and of course, above all else, it's a railroad town. It is not, at first, a town that is here because of roads, or even the Hoover Dam, that came later, but of course because of the railroad. And we forget that transshipment, which is now really the future of Las Vegas and a huge part of its economy, is in its very DNA and where it started. It is indistinguishable from most southwestern towns in its early architecture, though it very quickly, of course, tried to amp up its presence with El Dorado and other gimmicks that it tried to use to attract and keep the people who were coming for the railroad, lay the Hoover Dam and the mines to try and stay here. It remains, however, always a city that is at the edge of the desert. It is a desert city. And for me, that's kind of the fundamental question. However many hotels you build, however many signs you build, the big question about Las Vegas is, what will it be as a desert city in an era in which global climate change is happening, despite what the dork in the White House thinks? Sorry, I should have said that. No, I'm not sorry. we are going to experience extreme desertification in not only here, but also obviously in Phoenix and the other desert towns. And that desert has to be part of the future of Los Angeles. Doesn't matter how many signs you build. What are you going to do in and with the desert? And of course, don't forget that the other part of the desert is the uncontrollable acts of nature, such as the floods that have occurred here periodically. They're now somewhat tamed, but of course that problem will only get worse as we pave more of the desert and as the changes in climate become ever more violent. We saw it happening in Los Angeles this last year. It is only time before that kind of seasonal monsoons are going to do this again, but at a much grander level than we have today. But then there, of course, is the Strip, and I don't want to deny that it's there and that it is part of both the heritage and, therefore, the future of Las Vegas. But what I think is most interesting about it is not necessarily what it says about how we approach architecture as the electronic expressionism that Venturi and Scott Brown wound up burying in their later rather mediocre work, which is to say that excitement about extending the ability of architecture to create a sense of place, to create direction, to even create framing through the use of technology, through not only signs, but also air conditioning. We all know that none of this would have happened without air conditioning. And I was going to read to you, but that's always so stilted to read, so I would recommend to all of you something that is less well known than Learning from Las Vegas or even Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and that is An American Dream by Norman Mailer. The last chapter of that is about Las Vegas and his description of what he calls the second atmosphere, the submarine that you dive into in the hot summer, in the diadems of light, the necklaces of electronics that he describes in that book are absolutely spectacular. And of course, that's then what you wound up with. The Strip, big, bland blocks of hotels with ever more expressive signs, sucking up energy, sucking up water, finding a way to attract people continually in this desert landscape. I realize I fly so much that I get upgraded about 3/4 or half the time on domestic flights. I never get upgraded to Las Vegas. Never, ever, ever. And it's because whatever you guys are doing here, you people are doing here, it still is attracting millions and millions of people. But, of course, there is the Crystal City on one side, where Oz is probably living somewhere. I'm not sure quite who he is. And then there is the rest of Las Vegas, the 2 million plus people living in this valley and stretching ever further to the ranges of the mountains. It'll be interesting to see what happens when you actually reach the very limits of what this valley can do, although you can escape out into other directions. Will you leap over, or what are the actual limits of this place? And within that, you have created these kind of Edens for the rich, for the wealthy people of places like Summerlin, who can live in these wonderful parks and play in golf courses. And you have created this faux sense of urbanity that makes little moments, what Lars Lehrer would call stims, moments of urban intensity, pedestrian life, within this otherwise completely car or Uber-driven metropolis. And you are looking, of course, to diversify towards all kinds of other structures that will give you the monuments that most cities are meant to have, as well as the economy that will be more diversified. Of course, that part is not working so well. The monuments part is working better, although it's still amazing that you can't get a museum together here. Those of you that have been working on it, please keep working. This place needs a serious art museum if it's ever going to be a serious city. I've talked about that here before, and be happy to talk to anyone who wants to think about how to do that. And of course, you have to figure out now how to reuse and rethink what you already have. And I'll come back to that later. But one of the interesting things that's going on currently, and there's no way to show this, is that a lot of the work that's going on is repurposing of existing buildings. Think of the Monte Carlo now turning into the Park MGM, and some of the other ideas of what might happen to the Fontainebleau. I was assured this morning that it actually is going to happen. They are going to do something with it. They are not going to tear it down for the scrap metal, which I thought would have been just one of the most incredible stories of architecture if they had actually done this, but apparently it will turn into a new hotel. But where's the vision? This is what I keep wondering about. This is the current Las Vegas plan, as I'm sure most of you know. This is downtown, plans for various other places. But the weird thing about Las Vegas is that it happens because someone has a weird idea or someone just builds another subdivision. So you get this concentration of electronic expressionism that could be anywhere, but of course it's in Las Vegas because you have that critical mass here. Or you get complete, bland, environmentally and socially destructive subdivisions just leveling the landscape all around you. There are the subdivisions in this wonderful exhibit of Michael Light's work that was on display here, I think last year. There are moments of hope, and there are reasons to be extremely hopeful about what is going on in Las Vegas. Where there's money, there is the ability to get things done. So when you have a huge organization like MGM, they can actually sponsor pretty darn decent public space designed by a very good landscape architect, Jerry Van Eyck, and just about finished. Just ignore that sculpture in the middle. We won't talk about that. But a really quite interesting approach as to how you could take this desert landscape and make it into something that you would enjoy inhabiting. There are some landmarks here. I actually think this is a pretty good building. You have to remember that it was designed to have all this other stuff around it, which someday will happen, I would hope. But it certainly shows the possibility of making a pretty good duck, even if that's not what Venturi and Scott Brown thought we should do. And then, of course, there are some very good architects here, some guy called Strain, who are trying to make good buildings and finding ways to insert real architecture within the fabric of this city. And then, of course, there's the big story, which is downtown, which is actually two different stories intertwined. On the one hand, Zapotopia, with its not very good buildings that on the inside run riot and become, if you will, a sort of interior version of electronic expressionism. It's disappointing to think that all these people are just managing orders for sneakers, but as an environment, it is quite something. And then there is the whole east part of downtown, which again, there's some overlap with the renovation of El Cortez, and of course, the arrival of the container park, which is so eye-catching that it even features in movies and television series as an emblem of a new kind of urbanity. Note, however, that it is completely enclosed. It works because there's guards at the one place where you can get into them, keeping out all those kind of people who people do not want into this sanitized version, very successful, very beautifully designed version of Las Vegas. And then, of course, there is the promise that we are on the cusp of the kind of invigorating of a whole section of downtown with art on the outside and art on the inside, with the, what's it called, the art clinic? Did I get that right? No, but there's the first aid art, or what's it called, the building? Sorry? Emergency art, sorry, that was close. Emergency art, and some of the other attempts to actually bring a kind of from the bottom up Brooklynization. and pretty soon you'll have man buns and bikes and beards here everywhere. That could be a good thing, and it certainly is going to make good use of the fabric of the city. And the trailer park, that's the Zappos connection, is really quite an incredible alternative to some of the housing that has been going on around, even in Brooklyn and those kind of places. And then, of course, there are the more fanciful ideas of how Las Vegas could develop a high-rise architecture, an architecture that would be expressive, maybe even duck-like, it might even quack, that could answer to the bland towers all around it. By the way, I was going to do this in the beginning to get it over with, but I'll just say it now because someone has already asked me. Just to be clear how the events of last week fold into this as far as I'm concerned, they don't. Until there's nothing that we can do with architecture or design about a crazy person with a lot of semi-automatic rifles, except to all work to enact strict and meaningful gun control. If we don't do that, it doesn't matter what architecture is going to do. So I just want to be clear about that. So to go on with some of the other schemes that people have been developing or are developing for Las Vegas, here's this wonderful project some of you might know by Aranda Lash, to take the strip and roll it up into a kind of mandala, a spiral, a sacred symbol for the Native Americans, but also a way to turn the traffic jams into a continual movement in which people are delighted and get nothing. Get frozen in place. There we go. Thank you. People get, where was I? Delighted as they move around and are entertained by electronic expressionism and have a great view of the strip. If you want to ask me just a very simple, concrete thing, what should Las Vegas do? Good start to build this thing, however impossible it would be. It probably costs less than a new casino, so I think it might be a great way to start. It just happens that Chris Lash is our dean at the School of Architecture, but other than that, I'm unbiased. I just think it would be a good big start. And then, of course, the other thing that we've all been waiting for outside of Las Vegas is, when is Las Vegas going to theme the future? It's amazing, after all these years, you people have gone through tons of proposals for various kinds of sci-fi, space age, casinos, themes, and none of them ever get built. I don't know, did Craig Hodgetts show his version of, I don't know, none of you were here for that, I guess. Craig Hodgetts actually designed a spectacular sort of Star Wars-like casino a number of years ago. One of these days, one of these things could be built. Because of course this is what you planned. I'm sure you all know this. This was the dream of what Las Vegas was going to look like 1987 and beyond. I think we're a little behind here on the planning, but that certainly could be a very exciting version of what Las Vegas could become. So, looking at all of this and thinking about what Las Vegas should be, I just did a very simple thing, which all of you can do, is I went to Google, right, our great Bible these days, and I typed in Las Vegas future Las Vegas. And you get these visions of what Las Vegas could become. Either this somehow terraformed green nirvana, or this burned out ruin, this place that has finally succumbed to its origins as a place of transit, now completely stopped because you didn't build the Aranda Lash project, or in fact a last oasis in a world that has succumbed to the nuclear winter once we've done the thing with North Korea. Most probably, and this is what you get most of the responses for, what you would get would be a version of a desert. Interesting enough, I was trying to show Mad Max here. I'm telling you all the things I'm not showing you, which is unusual, but I was a little frustrated trying to put this together. Mad Max is completely copyright protected. It's very difficult to get the right images. Anyhow, you can imagine the kind of Mad Max future, which is actually the most logical future for Las Vegas, which is at some point, climate change is going to completely overwhelm this city. No matter how much air conditioning you put in place, no matter how much water you suck out of the Colorado River Basin or however you get it, once it gets to be above 120 degrees every single day here and spikes up to 140, which is what they're predicting within 15 to 20 years from now, not next century, 15 to 20 years from now, you will not be able to keep the city going. And that reality, I think, is something that Las Vegas, but also Phoenix and many of the other desert cities need to seriously think about. So, what should or could you do? Well, of course, you can create these moments of beauty and isolated control within there. You can look to casino cities that are growing at a much larger rate to see what they're doing, and you can look at what some other desert cities are doing in terms of thrusting ever higher around something that people pray to. I don't mean to be blasphemous here, but I'm just trying to build the analogy between people praying at the slot table. God, that is blasphemous. I'm sorry. I apologize. I didn't mean to say that. Let's just say that what interests me is that you create this incredible construction, this architecture around a site of attraction of that scale. And of course, the real model at this point for Las Vegas, where Las Vegas could be learning, should be in the United Arab Emirates, where they have figured out how to go much taller, much faster, how to diversify in a much better, more complete way, better maybe not. There, it's not obviously trains. It started out as dhows and caravans, and now has turned into the largest airport and the largest airline company in the world. It's all about air transport, but they also now are the largest port operators in the world. So it's also about freight, all the ocean freight. And at the same time, it's also becoming a financial center, it's becoming a medical center, it's becoming a whole host of other things. And they themselves are thinking about how you could actually create a more sustainable future for a desert city that is actually environmentally even more challenged than Las Vegas is right now. And this is their most ambitious proposal right now, and probably the most ambitious proposal that was has ever been done for this kind of climate. Norman Foster's Masdar City here, unfortunately, has turned into just a fragment of its overall plan, sitting rather isolated with suburban development around it. Of course, the other thing you could do is look at desert cities of the future, imagined, or the past. Think about where desert futures might be. I'm sure some of you recognize this. This is Tatooine in Star Wars, which is maybe what Las Vegas could become in the future. And these are the arcologies, at least as imagined, on the left by Paulo Soleri, on the right by someone just picking up on them. And another book I would highly recommend to you is a book called The Water Knife by Don Betsky, which is an incredible little novel in which he imagines the future of the desert Southwest, which it's going to become. But in his telling, Las Vegas has, in pure warrior state fashion, snarfed up all of the water rights from across the Southwest in collaboration with the narco lords in Mexico, according to him, and has put everyone who can afford it into arcologies that just leave the rest to become complete desert wasteland, but everyone can be inside of a pumped-up version of Aria or the Marina Sands and live their lives quite happily as their excrement is recycled into future food, and perhaps their bodies are as well. You could also look at some of the places where people are thinking about how to create a more intensive urbanism. And one of the great examples going on right now is Medellin in Colombia. Of course, we all remember Medellin from the days of narcos and the drug wars. Now it is one of the most successfully self-revitalizing cities in all of South America, with not only an extensive cable network, but a whole plan which they are carrying out for regreening and making public again the central core of the city. And of course you can, wait, I'm missing something there. Whoops, that's the other part. And creating buildings that are both landscapes and public attractions. This is a school and public park in one, and structures that provide shade and bring people together. And that was another example of how a city is taking its public spaces, its transportation corridors, and turning them into an amenity. This is a plan by West 8 in Madrid. But you could also go back to the older desert cities and look at how they manage heat with these very solid buildings that are continually rebuilt. You could also think about your own Boulder City and how that created in its very plan a civic focus and then a very controlled urban development, which unfortunately they then later abandoned. You could even go further back than that and think about what the Hohokam and before that the Anasazi and the Pueblo Indians later did in this desert Southwest, how they were able to create in a climate that perhaps was not as desertified as it is today, places of communal dwelling, of great perfection in their construction that use the natural landscape to create places where people could inhabit together. And one of the things that to me is important about almost all of these structures is that unlike the sharp distinction between the high-rises isolated by themselves and then the sprawl all around it, they intensify and bring together sprawl into inhabited structures that mix public spaces and private spaces, collectively creating a human-made answer to the nature beyond it and echoing the peaks of the San Juan Mountains. I am not suggesting that you should turn this place into Santa Fe. I just want to be absolutely clear about that. I'm not suggesting that some fake adaptation of a vernacular version of a high Spanish revival would be the appropriate thing to do. And if you want to look at the interpretations and misinterpretations of that history, there is an incredible show on right now at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art on the interplay between Mexico and California that I would highly recommend to you. However, you could look at both your own traditions and the traditions of a place like Palm Springs, which had that same kind of optimism about technology and its ability to rebuild a human community in a desert landscape that created some of the very, what are you laughing about? Yeah, well, built some of the very best communities in the desert Southwest. And if you are looking for a model on how to build in Las Vegas in a very simple way, this one complex might be a very good place to start, if you will. And you could also look at what someone like Antoine Predock has been doing for many, many years. You know, before he became known for those jutting angular structures and spirals, he was doing this magnificent, very affordable housing in Albuquerque called La Luz, which created a communal form, sheltered spaces, and of course, also in his ASU Art Center and Tempe, created this artificial mountain which could stand in the desert and then creates great shade underneath it. Rick Joy and Marwan and Wendell Burnett, sorry, all the people to forget, our great graduate from Taliesin. of course, made this wonderful Armagiri resort in southern Utah, which might be another model to look at. And then there was this guy called Lloyd Wright, who actually, for years, thought that we should figure out a way of bringing civic buildings, landscape, and the reality of sprawl together to create a coherent landscape. And I think, in the end, that is the thing that you need to think about most. The Strip will always be there, at least until the desert takes over. And the Strip will do better or worse depending on the vagaries of the tourist industry, and might be able to extend that through the Coliseum and all these other things that are planned. It might move from gaming completely into endless Chesto performances. Whatever it is, it's fine. Don't worry about it. Downtown will happen. It's going to become a very hip place. I'll give you $20, each one of you, that 10 years from now, if you walk out the door here, you'll be able to find yourself in a very hip and cool and habitable place. Perfectly fine. This is the issue. This is the thing that you need to be most concerned about. Where the actual people of Las Vegas live and come together, or don't come together. Where there is this incredible waste of natural resources, this incredible isolation, social isolation. I would again recommend a book to you, and that's the couple of chapters in The Goldfinch, which describes living in suburban Las Vegas in an absolutely harrowing manner. And of course, this, again, is something that is just happening in Las Vegas in a turbo-boosted manner. You know, LA has the water and a certain sexiness to it. Phoenix has a canal system and a bigger and more historic downtown. Las Vegas is the most extreme version of pointless sprawl, because the Strip has nothing to do with Las Vegas other than that people work there. Eric Strain taught me 20 years ago that the way to survive in the Strip, in Las Vegas, is to avoid the strips, to find ways around it. It's not Las Vegas. Other than that, there is nothing about Las Vegas other than sprawl itself. And you have to figure out what is the meaning of these cookie-cutter homes, of these endless strip malls where everything happens, from your dentist to your hairdresser to your restaurant to your grocery store to your dermatologist to everything else that happens in strip malls. What are you to make of this cancerous deformation of the great Jeffersonian grid on which Las Vegas is still founded? What are you to do with these 2 million plus people cocooning themselves in air conditioning and internet? What are you to do with the eruption or the spread of beige and brown and the other completely eye-draining and soul-bearing colors closely matched that are completely burying everything outside of the shadows of the casinos when the big signs and the strips are turned off? What are you going to do with places where violence is becoming endemic and crime is becoming endemic and addiction is becoming endemic because of the social isolation that they create? What are you going to do with suburbia? What are you going to do in an area where no one is from here and everyone is everywhere at the same time? What are you going to do beyond electronic expressionism in an era in which the sign is not just 12 stories tall, not just 80 stories tall, but is embedded in everything you carry around you, and soon enough, even in your DNA? What are you going to do in an era in which everywhere Big Brother is watching us because he has to be watching us because, as you found out, things can erupt in an instant, or rather in 10 minutes. What are you going to do when perhaps the only way to survive in this desert climate will be to adapt our bodies and become a kind of cyborg, specially engineered to be able to live in 140-degree heat? What are you going to do to prevent this kind of vision of a planet that is also a brain from taking over our consciousness? Anyone recognize this? What's that? What is it?
It's Guardians of the Galaxy.
Guardian, all right. That was my pop quiz moment, popular culture pop quiz moment. For those of you that haven't seen it, I won't give it away, but this is both a human being and a planet at the same time. And I love these kind of visions of what our future is going to be. But of course, this is what we are already building all around the world. This is the kind of electronic expressionism that we are seeing around us today. And we can imagine that perhaps it will even be possible to completely shape and form our environment through architecture. And we can imagine all kinds of utopias that will allow us to go beyond where we are today. But we can't do this. We can't create these nostalgic lies about what this country used to be and reserve them only for the few who can afford them, leaving millions of other people to live on the outskirts of the desert in a place completely devoid of any kind of culture, any kind of beauty, any kind of connection, any kind of social network. We have to think of ways in which we can answer to sprawl and find a way of bringing its logic altogether, a project by Keith Crumwitty, taking the logic of that Jeffersonian grid of suburban development and thinking about how it could be agglomerated into, if you will, a kind of Kiva-like structures, a kind of Taoist-like structures that would bring people together within the logic of suburbia. We can even imagine that we can start to bring suburbia alive, as they are doing in Marfa, Texas. And above all else, I think we have to start by marking where we are, by giving a finger to accepted power and ways of doing things, and of taking that electronic expressionism seriously. This is a project by Doug Aitken, an artist who has really become our poet of sprawl, doing a whole series of movies about what it means to live in a world of sprawl, and most recently erecting something called Mirage, which is a completely reflective house in Coachella, which we hope will soon come to Taliesin West. He did this project called Song 1, in which he covered one of the worst bits of post-war American monumental architecture, the Hirshhorn Gallery that sits like a curse on the mall, and covered it completely with images drawn from sprawl, from factories and anonymous streets and restaurants in the middle of the night and signs blinking off, until it finally resolved itself into a song whose lyrics, repeated over and over again, are, "I only have eyes for you. It is only this world that is all around us." And there are concrete ways in which we can sing our cities back to life again. You all know the High Line in New York, the single most successful piece of architecture in America since the Second World War, responsible for the creation, depending on who you talk to, of between $5 and $30 billion worth of value with investment of a few $1 million. creating this connective ribbon through the city, bringing out native vegetation, and turning watching the city and its car culture into a kind of theater. And of course, places all around the world are now copying this kind of idea of a connective urban space, are taking over existing environments. And this, to me, is really the strong possibility that you can learn in Las Vegas from taking these kinds of environments, these temporary places that Nike and people like that put up, and making your unused parking lots come alive, turning your public spaces into environments that are not fancied up for rich people, but that are usable for people of all sorts. You know, I love showing this example because many architects like to learn from Barcelona. In fact, there's a book that self-consciously carries forward on learning from Las Vegas called Learning from Barcelona. And it talks about the monumental tradition of Barcelona, the fact that they have found a way to take the great tradition of making meaning with buildings and bring it back alive again. Well, this is what's happened to Barcelona now, after all those grand parks that were built for and after the Olympics. This is the latest public park, which is not in the middle of a city, but is out in sprawl, on a site in the middle of a working-class neighborhood that had been a gun emplacement during the war and was then turned into a haphazard neighborhood as people just started building houses on it. The people who won this competition said, let's not build something new. Let's only tear down what we have to, and then bring this place alive again. Make it safe for people to sit there and see the city all around them. Architecture can be as simple as clearing out a rubbish dump in the back of a park and stacking the paving stones up to make a place for a poet or an architect to give a lecture. It can be as simple as piling up some stones or putting a staircase over another pile of stones. We might imagine that we can take all of those walls, not only the one that supposedly will be built near here at a gigantic cost and no function, but also the kind of walls that separate our communities all around here, and turn them into playgrounds, turn them into places we can use. We can imagine a connective tissue that would bring this whole city together, a rethinking of even the poorest areas, a reimagination that would allow us to densify and infill and develop our structures over time by allowing people to collaborate in that process. To do that, we have to look at the world around us, not be blinded by the signs of Las Vegas, not look just at the towering structures of the Strip, but think about what is all around us and how we might be able to take that vernacular, how we can find what is left over, what you drive through every day, and turn it into moments of beauty. Las Vegas should be learning from places all over the world that have realized that the last thing we need to do is build more structures. What you need to do is figure out how to reuse, rethink, and reimagine what you already have. How you can find beauty in what you once thought was leftover and useless. How you can take the objects and elements that our consumer society throws out continually and turn them into new forms of habitation and living. You'll see this project tomorrow, this beautiful renovation of a completely anonymous structure in Denver, of no intrinsic beauty until a good architect found the ability to create or find beauty within it. Another project you'll see tomorrow, taking one of those cinema one-too-manys that have outlived their usefulness right next to a highway, and turning it into a community college art center. Everywhere around the world, people are looking not at the beautiful signs of the future or the horror of what that might hold, but rather at what there is all around us right now. They are learning from the environment around them and trying to figure out how to reassemble it and make it better. This is another one of my favorite projects by a group called Urban Think Tank. I'm coming to the end. Urban Think Tank in Venezuela, who were confronted one day with this project for something a little bit like the Fontainebleau, a very large structure that was abandoned, never quite finished. A group of people moved into it, took it over until the 20th floor. What is an architect to do? They went in there and said, let's learn from this place. And in learning, let's talk to the rest of the world about it. Let's work with a photographer, Iwan Baum, to photograph how people have made their own places. And not pretend that we can help them, but figure out what we can learn from. This is the new kind of learning that we need to do today. We need not to look up at our buildings, but like these crazy Russian kids who go around the world climbing to the top of buildings, figure out how to look down at our world and see the beauty of what is below us. It's something I tried to do at the Shenzhen Biennale last year, where we asked people to not think of what the future of Shenzhen could be, but learn from Shenzhen, the instant city that has gone from 20,000 people to 20 million people in 30 years, to figure out how you could re-inhabit the office structures, the factories, and the old apartment buildings so that they can find new ways of living within them. How you can create the life of Shenzhen by finding the life that is already there. This is a project where people went around studying office spaces all around Las Vegas and found around Shenzhen, and found that the only thing that distinguished them was the plants that people brought in and the mirrors that they hung from the ceiling. So they turned that into an architecture. And this was a project where a group of architects took my call to reimagine Shenzhen literally and went around collecting things that people had thrown on the street, packing it together to create the building blocks of a reimagined Shenzhen. And that is certainly also what we're trying to do at Taliesin. Sorry, Eric, here it comes. This is why you should all come to Taliesin, where we are taking a desert climate like this is and trying to figure out how we can live in the desert Southwest, what we can learn from this landscape, what we can learn from the history of these places, how we can think of architecture not as making monuments or sprawl, but as a light and temporary inhabitation that brings people together in the making and in the continual remaking and reimagination of the place. And at the core of Taliesin are the student shelters, where the students design and build and inhabit their own places in the desert with no electricity or running water, in which they figure out what it means to live in the desert Southwest, how you can inhabit these kind of places and reuse them and rethink them. This was something that we're now looking at more and more, which is not building new shelters, but reusing existing ones and creating purposefully temporary ones that allow you to open yourself up to your landscape. So this is the last shelter that was done. The Crow's Nest, a beautiful place to wake up in the morning. And when I think about Las Vegas and drive around here, look down on it from my hotel room, I imagine that this could be a place where you could learn not only from the history by now mostly played out of electronic expressionism, where you can learn instead from the reality of your landscape, the reality of how people have reacted to it, from all the other experiments that have gone on around the world and are going on today, from both the nightmares and the dreams of what the future might hold. You can learn from all of that if you think about what it would take to truly be at home in this particular place that you have turned over the last 50 or 60 years from a small desert outpost into one of the fastest growing and still one of the most exciting and strangest places in this universe. You can build a better Las Vegas. You just have to figure out how to reuse, rethink, and reimagine what you already have. Thank you very much. Hi.
I'm Jennifer.
Hi, Jennifer.
So I've been dying to ask you this question because of everything that's been in the current news cycle about reimagine. So,
Wow, okay.
so in your
Yeah.
book, Building Sets, I
Uh-huh.
think you wrote that in 1995. So 22 years later. So I'm going to quote you, and I don't know if it's working.
Uh-huh.
But you said men grow.
Uh-huh.
Okay, men grow.
Uh-huh.
And their power is made real through architecture.
Uh-huh. Yep.
Do you still think that's true today? And if so, what advice do you have for me as a woman
Yeah.
designing?
It's a,
Well, as a woman designing in Las Vegas, and Las Vegas being a city that a lot of people may argue was built on two powerful contracts, sex.
wow. Good question, not what I was expecting. Good question. So just for those of you that don't know this very obscure book that I wrote many years ago, it was a book in which I looked at how the man-made world has been made by men, how women have had to make their own place within it, and how that's led to this bizarre association of architecture with what we think of as manly qualities of bigness and monumentality and strength, and then interiors with what we think of as feminine values, comfort and sense and sensibility and sensuality, how absurd all that was and how we got there. And at the end of the book, I said, how do we get out of that? And I was really optimistic, I guess sort of naively optimistic, because I was teaching then, and over half of my students were women, and that was obviously going to change everything. Well, guess what? Here we are, 2017, still about half, it's more or less gender balanced, depending on the school. Many schools even have more women in the first few years. And then as you go up, that gets less and less and less. By the time you get into entering the profession, it's 25 to 30%, and then it goes down even from that over time. It's unbelievable how baked in sexism is in this profession. Let's not even talk about the racism that's based into this profession, which is even worse. Well, I don't know if it's worse, but it's just hard to imagine that they're still there. And it's even hard for me to talk about it because I realize that I'm part of the problem. I've been talking about this as a almost dead white male for 30 years. And I notice it, and with the internet, of course, everyone notices it. We put together a jury panel or something, and it's still predominantly male, and it's a problem. We have to figure out what to do with it. So, but your question was, what do you do as a woman? All I can say is keep doing what you're doing, keep designing. I used to think that role models were sort of a silly idea, and then I've watched to see how incredibly important they are to people. So all I can say to you is become a role model. Become that person that makes other women and other people feel like they can be part of the profession, that they can really do what they want to do. It's the only thing I think we can really do. So keep designing really, really well so that you become a role model. And kill old men. Yes?
Adding on to that, how would we as a diverse range of students, because UNLV is the second most diverse campus
Really?
in the United States.
Oh.
Even if you go into our studio, you see a variety of races, you see a variety of ethnic backgrounds. How would that play into design back into the urban background class?
Really good question. I do think that one of the reasons that American cities are already changing is that, especially in places like this and Los Angeles, California in general, more and more people are coming there with a background that is very different from the suburban or European traditions and are looking for different ways of living and inhabiting the city. So I think that is impacting the development of places like LA and San Francisco and some other places, even in Texas. I'm not seeing it so much in Las Vegas yet, because I think that non-Caucasian people here are still, from what I know, but I don't know the politics, but from what I can see, have been still largely excluded from political power and development power, whereas they managed to take some of that power in those other cities. But I think that's going to be really interesting to see how that happens, even from the bottom up, as people demand new forms of housing. I think it will be a race, because it will be a race between people with a memory of other possibilities, shall we say, and other interests, and this culture's incredible ability to turn everything into McDonald's. And there have been two really good books written recently, one by a Latina and one by a Chinese woman, about food growing up eating McDonald's and then rediscovering their heritage, and then how that can be used to create community. So I think it's a race, because I would not be surprised if in the end suburbia wins, unless we as designers and thinkers do something about it. So again, she has to become a role model. I think if you want to fight for different ways of living in the desert Southwest, I think that's the most concrete and best thing we can do. But yeah, it's a lot of work to be done there. Second most diverse. What's the first most diverse? LA community or something?
We're tied for
What's
first.
that?
We're tied for first.
With Rutgers. Really? Huh. Interesting. Not what I would have thought. I think what's even better I think both UNLV and ASU have this statistic that over 60% of the undergraduates are the first members of their families to go to college. That's the kind of stuff that makes me excited about America, that stuff happens here. Encourage that.